They stormed onto my dock just minutes after I moved in, 3 HOA board members led by a furious Karen, pointing fingers and shouting that I had 72 hours to tear down my pier. What they didn't know was that the dock under their feet, the slips behind them, and even the marina fueling their luxury boats all belonged to me. They thought I was just another clueless newcomer until the truth hit them like a tidal wave. The morning air still smelled of salt and diesel, the kind of harbor scent that clings to your clothes long after you've gone back inside. My movers had just pulled away, their truck disappearing around the bend of the coastal road, leaving me alone on the pier with the sound of gulls overhead. I remember breathing in deep, thinking finally, peace. After years of staring at glowing monitors, chasing crypto deals that felt more like spinning roulette wheels, this place was supposed to be my retreat, my sanctuary. That illusion lasted less than 5 minutes. I saw them before I heard them, 3 figures marching in formation down the waterfront path, their steps sharp and deliberate like soldiers on patrol. The one in front was impossible to miss. She was in her mid-40s, perfectly pressed navy blazer over a striped blouse that looked more like a yacht club costume than practical harbor wear, blonde hair in a severe bob, pearl earrings that caught the morning sun. Her lips were pursed so tightly it looked like she'd been sucking lemons for breakfast. Behind her trailed 2 others, a gaunt man in his 60s fiddling with his phone like it was a shield, and a stern woman with a camera slung around her neck, snapping photos with professional precision. They didn't bother with greetings. The blonde woman planted herself right in the center of my pier, heels clicking on the weathered wood like gunshots, and barked. "I'm Meredith Caldwell, president of the Seabreeze Estates Homeowners Association. You are in violation of multiple community standards, and this dock must be dismantled immediately." The audacity of it nearly made me laugh. Here I was, barely unpacked, still smelling like moving boxes, and some stranger was already telling me to tear down the very pier that had sold me on this property. I tried civility first. "I think there's been some mistake. This is my property. I just closed on it 3 weeks ago." But she wasn't interested in mistakes. "Your structure is incompatible with the waterfront vision our community has worked so hard to maintain. Industrial-grade fixtures, commercial capacity, unsightly equipment. You have 72 hours to bring it into compliance or face legal remedies." The woman with the camera chimed in. "We'll be filing a formal complaint with the county. These images are evidence." Click, click. Another flash as she documented my pier like it was a crime scene. Meanwhile, the old man shuffled his papers and read in a monotone. Section 5.3 of the HOA bylaws clearly prohibits commercial fishing implements within residential boundaries. His hands trembled, but the smug satisfaction in Meredith's eyes told me this was all rehearsed. They'd done this before. I scanned the pier. My modest 24-foot fishing boat bobbed quietly, tied to heavy-duty cleats that looked like they could moor a battleship. Thick fuel lines ran under the planks. Industrial electrical hookups stood ready, and the structure itself was overbuilt. Reinforced steel pilings driven deep into the seabed. I'd noticed all this when I bought the property, but I hadn't connected the dots. To me, it was just sturdy. To them, it was evidence. "Look," I said evenly, though my blood was heating. I bought this place specifically because it wasn't under any HOA restrictions. My lawyer made sure of it. Meredith's smirk deepened, as if she pitied me. "You'll find that the association's authority extends further than your attorney led you to believe. This isn't about ownership, it's about standards. Standards we protect." Her tone was syrupy with condescension, and I felt my patience thinning. Protecting standards was the kind of euphemism bullies used when they wanted to disguise control as community service. As if on cue, the deep horn of an outbound vessel cut through the harbor. All of us turned as a massive fishing trawler lumbered past, its hull painted with the name Poseidon's Hammer. The captain waved at me a casual, familiar salute as though we'd known each other for years. I waved back instinctively, though we'd never spoken before. That tiny gesture lit Meredith's face with fury. She jabbed a finger at the ship. "Do you see? This is exactly the problem. Your little hobby is attracting commercial traffic to our residential waters. It's unacceptable. It would have been funny if it weren't so surreal. The idea that I, a man who hadn't even unpacked his silverware, was somehow responsible for directing maritime traffic in a public harbor, it was absurd. But Meredith wasn't joking. To her, the entire waterfront was her kingdom, and I was an invader who dared to exist outside her control. She leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume, sharp, citrusy, masking desperation. 72 hours. Remove the dock, the boat, everything, monsieur. Or you'll regret it. And just like that, they turned and marched away, their exit as theatrical as their arrival. The camera woman glanced back once, snapping one last photo before disappearing up the path. I stood there alone, fists clenched at my sides, heart pounding not from fear but from disbelief. I'd spent nearly $1 million for the promise of freedom, only to have a stranger tell me I owned nothing. But even in that moment of anger, one thought cut through. Why are they so desperate to erase this pier? I didn't know it then. But that question would unravel everything about the HOA, about my property, and about a fortune hidden in plain sight on this very harbor. 6 months before that confrontation, my life couldn't have been more different. I was sitting in a glass office tower in Seattle, surrounded by humming servers, screens glowing with graphs, and the constant stress of cryptocurrency markets. My company had grown from a garage project into a $47 million empire, contracts in Singapore, partnerships in New York, investors breathing down my neck every hour of the day. On paper, I was a success story. In reality, I was burning out. I'd built wealth in a world that didn't exist physically. It was all numbers, algorithms, data streams I could never touch. My hands ached for something real: wood, water, salt, the rhythm of life unmediated by silicon. So when Bitcoin peaked, I did the unthinkable. I sold it all: the servers, the facility leases, every coin in my wallet. 34 years old, flush with cash, and for the first time in a decade, free. That's when I found the listing. It was buried on the third page of a real estate website, a modest cabin tucked against the Washington coastline, priced at $920,000. At first glance, boy, it was nothing special. Cedar siding weathered by salt air, a steep roof with moss clinging to the shingles, and a narrow deck that looked like it had seen too many winters. But then I read the fine print. Maritime commercial agreements included, riparian rights attached to deed. Most buyers would have skipped right past that legal jargon, but years of combing through contracts had taught me that the smallest phrases could hide the biggest fortunes. So I picked up the phone and called the agent. 2 days later, I was standing in front of the cabin with its owner, Mrs. Gladys Perot. She was in her 70s, silver hair pinned back, hands trembling as she sifted through stacks of papers in a shoebox. Her husband, Harold, had passed away nearly 2 years earlier, leaving her with a property she didn't fully understand. She apologized over and over for not knowing the details of Harold's dock business, as she called it. The house itself was modest, maybe 1,200 square feet, with knotty pine paneling and a stone fireplace. But the pier, God, the pier was something else. It stretched nearly 200 feet into the harbor, wider and sturdier than anything a private homeowner could possibly need. Heavy mooring cleats lined the edges. Industrial-grade electrical hookups dotted the planks, and thick pipes ran underfoot, the kind used for fueling vessels. Harold loved this place, Gladys said softly, handing me a massive keyring with at least 30 keys of different shapes and sizes. These were his life: boats, storage sheds, offices I never knew what half of them opened. He was always down at the docks, signing papers with captains, fixing things, talking business. She gave a small but embarrassed laugh. I just kept to my garden. I turned the cold weight of that keyring in my hand and felt a jolt of curiosity. No ordinary homeowner needed 30 keys for a single dock. That afternoon, I walked the property again. The details screamed commercial operation. Reinforced pilings sunk deep into bedrock, bollards designed for vessels much larger than pleasure craft, and across the water, I saw the morning bustle of harbor life crab boats creaking under the weight of traps, sleek yachts preparing for weekend charters, and tankers slowly drifting out to sea. When I asked Gladys what exactly her husband had run here, she only shook her head. Harold always said the water was complicated. Best leave it to the men who understood. To her, this was a headache she wanted gone. To me, it was a mystery begging to be solved. I made an offer on the spot. She accepted with visible relief, happy to be rid of the paperwork, the maintenance, the memories. And just like that, with one signature, I became the owner of not just a cabin, but something much larger, something I didn't yet comprehend. The closing was smooth, my attorney confirming there were no HOA covenants attached to the deed. That detail had been critical for me. I'd read enough horror stories about homeowners associations to know they were dictatorships with landscaping committees. I wanted solitude, not surveillance. Weeks later, when the moving truck pulled into my driveway, I felt liberated. My belongings were sparse, minimalist furniture, a few keepsakes, my computer gear packed away in crates. I had no intention of living large. I wanted quiet mornings with coffee, sunsets over the harbor, and a chance to reconnect with a life that didn't require a password. But that key ring sat heavy on my nightstand. 30 keys, 30 unanswered questions. On my first night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I walked down the pier in the moonlight, the planks creaking under my weight. I tried a few keys in padlocks I found along the way, storage sheds, fuel lockers, a maintenance hut at the far end. Some fit, others didn't. Each click of a turning key deepened my suspicion this wasn't just a private pier. This was infrastructure. At the time, I didn't realize how explosive that discovery would be. That ring of keys wasn't just metal, it was leverage, a legacy, a gateway into a hidden world of maritime rights and business deals. And it was the very thing Meredith Caldwell and her HOA cronies wanted to erase. 3 days passed after that first encounter, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had been a bizarre misunderstanding. Maybe Meredith and her board would cool off, realize they'd overstepped, and leave me in peace. But that hope died the following Saturday morning when I saw them again, this time not marching in silence, but arriving with binders, clipboards, and the unmistakable swagger of people convinced of their own authority. Meredith strode onto my property without hesitation, heels clacking across the wooden pier like she owned it. The woman with the camera was back too, snapping wide shots of my modest fishing boat, zooming in on the industrial-grade cleats, even photographing my shed door as if it were contraband. The old man was replaced this time by another board member, a stocky fellow in his 50s with a polo shirt tucked too tightly into his khakis, the kind of man who'd practiced his official scowl in the mirror. "Mr. Carroway," Meredith began, deliberately mispronouncing my name, even though I'd corrected her the first time. "We've received additional reports of violations regarding your dock. The association is deeply concerned." She waved her hand toward the shed at the end of the pier. "Unsightly structures, potential fire hazards, questionable equipment stored in full view of the community." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the crab pots I bought from a marine supply store, the ones stacked neatly and chained down?" Her lips curled. "Industrial fishing equipment." The stocky man stepped forward, opening a binder filled with highlighted text. He read aloud as though delivering a sermon. "Per Seabreeze Estates Bylaws, Section 8.1. All residential waterfront properties shall maintain aesthetic conformity consistent with community values, prohibiting any commercial grade or unsightly installations." The camera snapped again. Meredith folded her arms smugly. "You see, the rules are very clear. You're out of compliance." I let out a short laugh. "Except those bylaws don't apply to me. My attorney was explicit this property isn't subject to your HOA. Meredith's eyes hardened. "You can believe whatever you like, but when we file for enforcement, the county will side with us." They always do. Something about the way she said it made my stomach knot. Not the words, but the certainty. The absolute conviction that she could bend the law to her will. I dealt with enough self-appointed tyrants in the crypto world to recognize the type. Power wasn't about truth to people like her, it was about pressure, intimidation, and wearing you down until you caved. But I wasn't planning to cave. "Listen," I said, my patience thinning. "I bought this property free and clear. Whatever little rules you think you can enforce here, they don't apply. So unless you have a court order, I'd suggest you stop trespassing." Her expression soured instantly, from fake charm to open hostility. Trespassing. This pier juts into community waters. That makes it subject to association oversight. That's not how maritime law works, I shot back. And unless one of you has a badge, you're standing on my dock without permission. The camera woman lowered her lens for the first time, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But Meredith doubled down. "You'll regret this defiance. We're giving you 72 hours to comply. Tear it all down, or we pursue legal remedies. And let me assure you, the cost of fighting us will be far greater than simply obeying." They left as abruptly as they'd come. But this time, something in me had shifted. They weren't just neighbors with too much time on their hands. They were organized, aggressive, and disturbingly confident. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the ring of keys spread out in front of me. One by one, I turned them over, feeling their weight, their age, the history they hinted at. Every instinct screamed that Meredith's obsession wasn't about aesthetics or community standards. She wanted this pier gone because it represented something she didn't control, something bigger than she wanted me to know. I needed answers, and fast. That night, I called my younger brother, Ethan. For 12 years, he'd practiced maritime law in Seattle, untangling disputes about fishing rights, ferry terminals, and dock leases. If anyone could make sense of what was happening, it was him. I laid out everything: the HOA's threats, their supposed bylaws, their fixation on my pier, even the strange recognition I'd gotten from that trawler captain passing by. Ethan listened in silence, then chuckled softly. "Marcus, this smells like classic HOA overreach, but it could be more. Waterfront property isn't simple. It's a tangle of rights, easements, and old agreements that most homeowners don't understand. Before you do anything, you need a full title search. Find out exactly what came with your deed." He paused, then added, "And start documenting everything, every visit, every threat, every so-called violation. If they're pushing this hard, there's a reason. You may be sitting on more than just a nice view." I hung up, staring out the window at the pier glowing under the moonlight. The wood looked weathered, scarred by decades of tides, storms, and anchors. How many boats had tied up there before mine? How many deals had been signed, fish unloaded, hands shaken? The HOA thought they were cornering me, but deep down, I sensed the opposite was true. They had picked the wrong man to bully, and in their arrogance, they'd just awakened a fight they weren't prepared to finish. 2 days later, the mystery began to unravel. It started with a simple conversation at the Marina Diner, a place that smelled of frying bacon, salt, and strong coffee. I sat at the counter, flipping through the stack of documents the previous owner's widow, Mrs. Perot, had given me. Most of it looked like a mess of receipts, old fuel orders, and maintenance logs. But the waitress, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise who'd worked there since the early 90s, leaned over and pointed at the letterhead of one document. "Where'd you get that?" she asked. I looked down. It was an invoice for Black Ridge Maritime Operations, dated 7 years earlier. "It came with the property," I said cautiously. Her eyebrows shot up. "You're Harold's successor, then." The word successor hit me like a punch. "What do you mean, you bought the Perot place? Didn't you? Everybody knows Harold ran the docks out of there. Fueling contracts, slip rentals, the Coast Guard deal. Man practically built half this harbor's economy." She poured me more coffee. "Didn't your realtor explain any of that?" No, she hadn't. By the time I left the diner, I had a list of names and phone numbers: captains, mechanics, longshoremen, people who'd worked with Harold over the years. Each conversation I had over the next 48 hours painted the same picture. I hadn't just bought a cabin and a pier. I'd inherited a business, a maritime enterprise. The 30 keys Mrs. Perot had handed me suddenly made sense. They weren't random relics from her husband's life. They were operational keys for fuel depots, storage sheds, even gated access to commercial slips scattered throughout the harbor. That evening, I walked the pier with a different perspective. Where I had once seen wood and steel, I now saw infrastructure an artery of the harbor. The industrial power hookups weren't overkill. They were designed to service vessels that needed serious electricity. The fuel pipes weren't decorative relics. They were still connected to tanks buried beneath the shoreline, tanks that once pumped thousands of gallons into commercial boats. I called Ethan again, explaining what I'd learned. His tone shifted from amused to serious in seconds. "Marcus, listen carefully. If that's true, you don't just own a cabin. You own Black Ridge Maritime. That means established contracts, riparian rights, and possibly federal licensing agreements. You need a maritime attorney yesterday." He recommended a colleague of his in Seattle, Victoria Alden, a specialist in waterfront property and maritime commerce. I booked an appointment for the next morning. Victoria's office was lined with nautical charts and shelves stuffed with binders. She looked over the documents I'd brought, then leaned back in her chair with an expression halfway between disbelief and delight. "Mr. Carroway, do you realize what you've stumbled into? You own controlling interest in a marina operation that's been running for decades. According to these papers, you hold leases for 43 commercial slips, a fueling station, and even a Coast Guard training facility agreement. This isn't residential property. This is a commercial maritime hub." I sat there stunned. "But the HOA Meredith Caldwell, she says my pier violates their bylaws. They've given me 72 hours to tear it down." Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "They don't have a leg to stand on." The HOA can't regulate maritime commerce, especially not pre-existing operations. If anything, they're interfering with federally protected business. That's a crime in itself. Her words rang in my ears long after I left her office. On the drive back, I pulled over at a scenic overlook that gave me a clear view of the harbor. Boats came and went, lines cast, gulls wheeled overhead. But now, I understood the truth. Every vessel fueling up, every slip filled with nets and gear, every captain waving on their way out to sea, they were part of my operation. Meredith and her HOA weren't just trying to control appearances. They were trying to erase something far larger, an empire Harold had built and I had accidentally inherited. And suddenly, their desperation made perfect sense. If I didn't know what I owned, it would be easier for them to bully me into surrendering it. But I knew now, and there was no going back. The next week, the war escalated. Meredith and her board didn't march down to my pier. This time they went public. By Tuesday morning, flyers had appeared in every mailbox of Seabreeze Estates. On glossy paper with HOA letterhead, the message was clear: unauthorized commercial operations threaten our community. Beneath the headline was a photo of my modest fishing boat, framed to look like some rusted industrial barge. They accused me of running illegal maritime commerce, endangering water quality, and lowering property values. They urged residents to stand together to preserve the character of Seabreeze Estates. It was absurd. And yet, as I walked through the neighborhood, I felt eyes on me, curtains twitching, whispers following my steps. Meredith had tapped into the oldest fear in any HOA property values. To them, nothing was more terrifying than a few dollars slipping off their Zillow estimate, and she was weaponizing that fear with surgical precision. By Thursday, she had escalated again. Local media picked up the story. A reporter from the Coastal Chronicle showed up at my pier, microphone in hand, asking if I had a permit for my industrial equipment. Meredith must have fed them the line, because the article that came out that weekend painted me as a reckless newcomer ignoring community standards. But here's the thing about media storms: they cut both ways. For every suspicious neighbor glaring at me in the grocery store, there was a harbor worker shaking my hand, thanking me for keeping Harold's legacy alive. The fishing captains, the fuel depot staff, even the Coast Guard trainers, they knew the truth. Still, Meredith wasn't finished. That Saturday night, she convened what she called an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers taped to lampposts invited the community to witness the final steps in resolving the dock violation. The wording made it sound like a sentencing hearing. I wasn't invited, but I showed up anyway. The community center was packed, folding chairs arranged in tight rows. Meredith stood at the front, flanked by her board, a large projector screen behind her. She clicked through slides like a prosecutor in court photos of my dock, my crab pots, even a zoomed-in shot of the power hookups beneath the pier. "This is not residential use," she declared to a room full of nodding heads. "This is industrial abuse of our community's waterfront. If we allow this, what's next? Tankers docking in our backyards, refineries on our beaches. We must act before it's too late." Her words drew murmurs of agreement, even applause. Then she introduced her ace in the hole, a lawyer from a downtown firm, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, hair slicked back. He stepped forward with the confidence of a man who billed by the hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "our review of zoning laws confirms that no private resident may operate commercial maritime facilities within Seabreeze Estates. The presence of industrial-grade infrastructure, combined with evidence of vessel traffic, constitutes a violation. The association is fully within its rights to seek injunctive relief. We will file on Monday unless immediate compliance is achieved." The room erupted in cheers. Sitting in the back row, I felt every eye turn toward me, their gazes sharp with judgment. I could almost hear their thoughts. "There's the man ruining our neighborhood." I stood, letting the noise die down. "If I may," I said, projecting my voice across the hall. The room quieted, but the hostility was palpable. Meredith's eyes narrowed to slits. "I'm Marcus Carroway. You all know me as the guy with the dock. What you don't know, what you haven't been told, is the truth about what that dock actually is. I didn't buy this property to run some side hustle. I inherited something much bigger, something that's been here decades longer than Seabreeze Estates. Oi, Mizel. And whether you realize it or not, many of you have benefited from it for years." Murmurs rippled through the room. A few faces showed confusion. Meredith hissed, "This is not the time." But I pressed on. "On Monday morning, I'll be sitting down with my maritime attorney. We'll be reviewing every contract, every lease, every federal agreement tied to my property. And I promise you this, once those facts come out, you'll see exactly who's been violating the law. And it isn't me." Silence followed. Meredith forced a brittle smile, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The meeting adjourned in chaos, some siding with her, some whispering questions, most unsure what to believe. But one thing was clear, the HOA had chosen the battlefield. They wanted a legal war, and I was more than ready to fight it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of fog that swallows the harbor whole, leaving only the sound of seagulls and the occasional horn of a passing ship. I drove to Seattle with a folder stuffed full of documents, Harold's invoices, lease agreements, even the mysterious handwritten notes I'd found in his old filing cabinet. Sitting across from me at a polished oak desk was Victoria Alden, maritime attorney and Ethan's trusted colleague. She was in her early 40s, sharp eyes behind rimless glasses, the kind of lawyer who exuded confidence without ever needing to raise her voice. She spread the papers across her desk, skimming them with practiced efficiency. "Marcus," she said after a long silence, "you haven't just bought waterfront property. You've bought a controlling stake in Black Ridge Maritime Operations. That means you don't merely own a dock, you own a commercial marina, complete with federally recognized riparian rights and a network of long-term leases." I blinked, still trying to process it. "A marina? You mean like fueling rights for commercial vessels, slip rentals for more than 40 boats, a Coast Guard training facility contract, and regional fishing fleet agreements?" She finished for me. She tapped one of the contracts. This one alone, with the Coast Guard, has been renewed annually since 1992. That's federal jurisdiction. No HOA in the world can touch it. I felt my pulse quicken. Meredith hadn't been trying to enforce community aesthetics. She'd been trying to strangle a business empire she didn't even understand. Victoria leaned back, steepling her fingers. "Here's the strategy. First, we file a title report and confirm every single right attached to your deed. Then we prepare a cease and desist order against the HOA for interference in maritime commerce. Finally, we gather evidence of financial damages caused by their harassment, canceled contracts, lost clients, anything that ties back to their intimidation. If they want a legal war, they've already lost." Her words were like oxygen. For the first time since moving in, I felt the ground steady beneath me. Over the next 48 hours, Victoria and her team dug into the archives. What they found was staggering. Black Ridge Maritime had been operating continuously for 35 years. The pier and fuel lines were legally registered as commercial infrastructure, not residential. Every resident of Seabreeze Estates was, in fact, paying fees through their HOA assessments that funneled directly into Black Ridge's accounts, a legacy of a 99-year lease Harold had signed with the developers. In other words, Meredith's HOA wasn't my regulator. They were my tenants. By Thursday, Victoria called with news that nearly made me laugh out loud. Marcus, the HOA has already cost you damages. 2 charter companies canceled their bookings this week after hearing about the so-called zoning dispute. That's $87,000 in lost revenue. We'll be adding it to the claim. When I hung up, I paced my cabin like a caged animal. Every nerve in me buzzed with a mix of anger and anticipation. Meredith thought she was about to crush a homeowner. What she didn't realize was that she had just poked a corporation protected by federal maritime law. The showdown came the following weekend. Meredith convened another emergency HOA meeting, this time in the community center gymnasium. Folding chairs filled the floor, residents buzzing with tension. A banner hung at the front, "Protect our waterfront." She stood beneath it, looking like a general before battle, her hired lawyer at her side. I didn't come alone. Victoria walked in with me, briefcase in hand, her presence commanding the room before she'd said a word. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as we took seats in the front row. Meredith launched into her performance. Slide after slide projected images of my pier, crab traps, fuel lines. She painted me as a lawbreaker, a man endangering their homes for personal gain. Her lawyer stepped up, citing zoning codes with the flourish of a man convinced he'd already won. The audience nodded, clapped, even shouted approval. Then Victoria rose, calm, unshaken. She walked to the front, placed a rolled harbor map on the table, and unfurled it with a snap. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly, "what you've just heard is a fiction. Allow me to show you the facts." She traced the map with a laser pointer. Red lines marked the marina's true boundary slips, fueling stations, Coast Guard facilities. All of this is Black Ridge Maritime Operations. It predates your HOA. It is federally protected. And as of last month, it belongs to my client, Mr. Carroway. Gasps filled the room. Meredith's lawyer fumbled through his notes, clearly blindsided. Victoria pressed on. For decades, this community has paid annual fees through your HOA dues for harbor access and services provided by this very marina. That means every one of you has been a beneficiary of what my client now owns. Your president's attempt to shut it down has already caused documented damages of $87,000, with more accruing daily. Under federal maritime commerce law, that is illegal interference, and the responsible parties can be held personally liable. Silence. Absolute silence. I watched Meredith's face drain of color as her neighbors turned to stare. The very people she thought she controlled were beginning to realize she'd endangered their entire community. For the first time since moving in, the balance of power had shifted. The silence in that gymnasium was the kind that hummed in your ears, heavy and oppressive. Meredith stood at the front, lips parted but no words coming out, her expensive pearl earrings catching the fluorescent lights as though mocking her. Her attorney shuffled papers with frantic hands, muttering to himself, clearly realizing he'd been blindsided. Then came the first voice from the crowd, an older man with weathered skin, the kind that comes from decades on the water, rose from the back row. "Is this true? We've been paying fees to his marina all along." His tone wasn't hostile toward me, it was incredulous, directed squarely at Meredith. Victoria nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. The records are clear. Your HOA dues have always included payments for waterfront access, fuel discounts, and slip maintenance services provided by Black Ridge Maritime. That arrangement was established nearly 30 years ago." Murmurs erupted through the crowd, spreading like wildfire. Heads turned, voices rose. Neighbors who'd been glaring at me hours earlier were now glaring at Meredith. Another resident, a young mother holding her toddler, stood up. So all these meetings, These threats you've been wasting our money to fight the very operation that keeps this harbor alive." Meredith tried to recover, raising her hands like a preacher calming a congregation. No, you don't understand. This man is twisting things. Black Ridge is defunct. It hasn't operated legitimately in years, but before she could spin her lie further, a booming voice cut her off. Captain Morales, the grizzled skipper of the Poseidon's Hammer, the same vessel that had saluted me days earlier, stepped forward. His boots echoed against the gym floor as he approached. "With respect, ma'am, you're dead wrong. I fueled my ship at Black Ridge just last season. Harold kept this place running until the day he died. And now his successor, he pointed to me, owns what you've been trying to erase." The room erupted not in cheers, but in outrage. Shouts of, "She lied to us," and "You've endangered all of us," filled the air. Meredith's lawyer, seeing the tide turn, quietly packed his briefcase and slipped out the side door, abandoning her without so much as a glance. Victoria raised her voice just enough to be heard over the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must also inform you that Mrs. Caldwell's actions have already cost the marina documented financial damages $87,000 in canceled contracts, postponed Coast Guard training, and diverted fishing operations. Under federal commerce law, she and anyone complicit could be held personally liable." Gasps. Someone muttered, "$87,000. Another added, "She could bankrupt us all." Meredith's face went pale. She opened her mouth to retort, but her own neighbors drowned her out. A chorus of voices demanded her resignation. Others shouted that she should pay restitution. One man even stood up and declared, "If she costs us this community, I'll sue her myself." For the first time since I'd met her, Meredith Caldwell looked small, stripped of authority, stripped of her entourage. She was just a woman cornered by the very mob she'd once controlled. I rose from my seat then, careful to keep my voice steady, not triumphant. "I never came here looking for a fight. I bought this property to live in peace. But peace doesn't come from intimidation, and it doesn't come from lies. Black Ridge Maritime has been a backbone of this harbor for decades. I intend to honor that legacy, not tear it down." The room hushed. People looked at me differently now, not as an intruder, but as the rightful steward of something that had always been part of their lives. Finally, Margaret Chen, a retired teacher who everyone seemed to respect, stepped forward. She turned to the crowd. I motioned that Meredith Caldwell resign as HOA president, effective immediately, and that we, as a community, work with Mr. Carroway to strengthen our partnership with Black Ridge instead of tearing it apart. The vote was nearly unanimous. Hands shot up, voices echoed, and within minutes, the woman who had stormed my pier like a conqueror was stripped of her crown. Meredith staggered back, muttering denials, but no one listened. She gathered her bag and fled the hall, shoulders hunched, dignity in tatters. In her place, Margaret was elected interim president, promising to rebuild trust and cooperation. The crowd that had once cheered my destruction now applauded my role as their partner. As Victoria and I left the building, the night air felt lighter. She looked at me with a sly smile. "Well, Marcus, that's one queen toppled. But trust me, the real game has only just begun." And she was right. Meredith might have been finished, but the battle for Black Ridge's future was only beginning. In the weeks that followed Meredith's downfall, the entire atmosphere of Seabreeze Estates shifted. Where once I'd felt the cold glares of suspicious neighbors, I now received warm waves and quiet thank yous. The hostility that had poisoned the air seemed to dissipate overnight, replaced with cautious optimism. Meredith's house went on the market within days, listed at a desperate discount, and by the end of the month, a moving truck carried her away in silence. Under Margaret Chen's leadership, the HOA pivoted from an adversary to a partner. Our first meeting wasn't a courtroom battle, but a barbecue at the community park. Families brought food, kids ran along the shoreline, and my marina staff gave tours of the docks, explaining how the fueling systems, slip rentals, and Coast Guard training worked. For the first time, the residents saw not a threat, but an asset, a lifeline woven into their daily lives. Victoria finalized a settlement agreement that required Meredith to pay $65,000 in damages for the financial disruption she'd caused, a sum painful enough to sting, but merciful compared to the liability she truly faced. In exchange, the community signed a new memorandum of cooperation with Black Ridge Maritime, formally acknowledging the marina as a protected business and ensuring no future HOA president could weaponize bylaws against it. Standing on the pier one evening, I watched the sun sink into the Pacific, painting the sky with ribbons of orange and violet. Fishing boats returned heavy with catch, gulls wheeled overhead, and neighbors strolled the shoreline, greeting me not with suspicion, but with a sense of belonging. I realized then that what I had purchased was not just land or rights, it was a legacy. Harold Perot had built something enduring, something that bound the community and the harbor together. By sheer accident, I had become its steward. And irony of ironies, it was Meredith's hostility that had forced me to uncover its true value. Had she left me alone, I might never have dug through Harold's contracts or called my brother for legal advice. I might have treated this place as nothing more than a rustic retreat. Instead, her aggression revealed that I was standing on a foundation of opportunity far greater than any digital fortune I had ever made. The fight with the HOA taught me something I will never forget. Power is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it hides in the fine print, in decades-old agreements, in the quiet loyalty of people who work with their hands. Meredith thought she could intimidate me into surrender, but all she did was expose her own ignorance. Now, every morning as I walk the pier with a mug of coffee in hand, I feel anchored in a way I never did staring at computer screens. The gulls, the salt, the clatter of rigging against mass, it all reminds me that wealth measured in community, in legacy, in trust, is far more resilient than numbers in a digital wallet. This story isn't just about defeating a petty tyrant in a red blazer. It's about remembering that real strength comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to stand firm when others try to bully you. Meredith thought she had power because she had a title, a board, and a set of rules. But titles mean nothing when the law and the truth are on your side. In life, people will always try to control what they don't understand. The key is to know your worth, to research your rights, and to never let fear dictate your choices. Whether it's a homeowners association, a boss, or anyone who thrives on intimidation, stand tall. You may discover, as I did, that you're stronger than they ever imagined. So, if this story resonated with you, drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with a Karen trying to control your life? And don't forget to subscribe because there are more HOA battles, more dramas, and more twists waiting that you won't want to miss.